Hello everybody, this is Alex once again and welcome to the second part of my Queen Mary paper model build. Today I'm happy to be sharing with you a new update on the build, much sooner than what I usually tend to publish anything. And on this video I am to be covering the decks and hull of the model. And also just quickly letting you know that I have a tiny surprise for another upcoming project at the end of this video. But for now, let's get into it. So far, I have completed the internal structure and framing of the model, which I covered on the first part of this series in case you want to give a look at that first. And as always, I am leaving a link to the company's website from where I purchased this model if you're interested in getting something like this or anything else from their catalog. Just like on the first video, I encountered some problems in the first steps of this update, although this time it was related to the video production side of things. As you can see, I have begun by starting to work on the aft decks of the ship, but for some reason the footage I took of these first steps just transferred as still images. Since I lost the footage, I'll just leave you with some of the stills from that part. But basically, as you can see, it just consisted on cutting out the first couple of rearmost decks and attaching some of the first walls to those decks. And after dealing with those first couple of decks, the instructions indicate to focus on cutting and assembling some of the machinery and equipment elements that populate those aft decks. From here, only the element with its pieces marked by the yellow tag will be left for later, as the kit requires you to supply your own set of tubes, rods, and wires for some of the finer details on certain elements. And it was nice for a change to turn and work on some smaller details. While starting to work with much smaller pieces, I thought it would be a good idea to change to a new blade to manage those very fine cuts like this skylight element that I'm starting with. As I start to work with round elements like these capstans for example, I use a piece of aluminum wire that is pretty soft, malleable and easy to work with in order to roll and form the tiny cylinders. When I get to deal with the smaller elements like these bollards, I found it harder to use the end tab that closes the little cylinders together. Instead, I began cutting them away entirely and just gluing them edge to edge, with the feel that it looked much cleaner at the end. And just about to wrap up with this first set of small details, I'm finishing here with the assembly of some tall air vents. In the end, I gathered everything up in this little plastic box for convenient storage, as they will not be installed at the moment like the instructions suggest. First, because I can't finish all the elements without the extra supplies I mentioned before, but mainly because I don't want them in the way as I'm assembling the larger deck and hull pieces together. Speaking of deck pieces, I'm back again with the aft decks I showed earlier in the pictures, to continue the assembly of some of the first pieces. In this case, I'm gluing these pieces back to back in sections to avoid things like warping and giving myself more control over the fit with an even gluing. I come back to my sheets to cut out the next section of decks at the stern. I pay some careful attention at the small details like ladders, and as always, I get all my scoring done around the piece in order to make the foldings. This is another pair of pieces that come together to thicken another deck section. So I go by it applying pretty much the same process as before. I mark the proper alignment of the piece during my test fitting, and so I can begin gluing from the flat starting edge and then just work my way up from there. All that is missing in order to complete this section of deck are the walls that are attached to it. I make quick work on that last piece, and so I can carry on with completing the last stern assembly by adding the wall. And with that, here are the 3 stern sub-assemblies put together. Quick tip for myself from now on is always to mark my pieces once I have them cut. It just avoids losing track of them during the assembly process and saves on time when basically researching for the right piece. And from here on, I jump to the opposite side of the ship to begin work at the bow. And first order of the day is to cut out all the pieces and deal with the scoring for this whole section of the ship. As learned earlier, I try not to forget to mark my pieces after taking them out. And there you go, nice and fresh out of the sheets. I continue on taking care of all the folding, preparing the gluing tabs and giving proper shaping to each of the pieces. By the way, I almost forget to make the cutout for the mast. Glad I noticed that one on time. All prepped up and ready for gluing, I can move on and get my deck pieces assembled into the sub-assemblies of the bow. Right here, I just want to point out this marking that I'm making on the back of this wall before assembling it, as there is not much of a guide for the next deck level that is glued from behind this wall further on. And with the bow decks complete, I now have all my deck sections ready to be installed into the frame of the bottle. Keeping with the instructions, I begin assembly of the first decks at the stern. Just before applying each section, I go about drawing a middle mark to make it easier when having to align the pieces. I begin by attaching the deck piece to the bulkhead section where it ends, and then I glue down from there into the tabs and sections below. With the first set of decks added at the stern, I finally get a glimpse of scale with this model. Very barren now without any other element, but I really enjoy looking at the plain, under construction look. Now it's time to continue forward with the bow deck assembly. The assembly goes once again from the bottom up, starting with the lowest section here being the well deck subassembly. From here, I follow pretty much the same procedure as with the stern assembly, marking center lines and reference lines for the pieces, attaching them to the bulkhead, and gluing everything in steps from there. And once again, with the bow section complete, the scale is starting to come through with just these first decks. The ship, for one, is now beginning to have a face, and as barren as it is, I think it's looking pretty decent so far. And looking even better on display right at my windowsill as it slowly transforms into a ship. By the way, if you have seen my first video for this build, you might have noticed that the place looks a little different now. And that is due to the fact that I have been changing addresses abroad lately, which in part is one of the reasons why I had to pause activity on my channel for some time. Fun fact about this new place is my model was actually wider than the windowsill, so I had to mock up an adapting piece that could accommodate the model. I ended up crafting a couple of adapters out of delivery boxes, and I painted them with some spare gray paint I had. And I think the color looks kind of neat, as it being pretty neutral, it's easier for me in some way to imagine the ocean color, as if she really was on the water. Oh, and I said a couple of adapters because I made for both of my windows. Gotta keep it balanced. Okay, enough about that, and back to one of the biggest parts of this build, as it is time to begin work on the skin of the frame, which consists mainly of these big hull pieces and then some. So naturally, I begin by cutting the sheets for these big pieces into more manageable sizes. I also take care of separating from the sheets all the smaller pieces that I will be needing for this main step of the hull. Now, with all the pieces sorted in front of me, I decide to work with the port side first, which that would mean the left side of the ship. Funny thing, I discovered a small error with the labeling of the pieces, as I had two 74A left pieces instead of having a left and a right. Going past that nuisance, I proceed to cut out all these smaller pieces first. Right here, I'm doing a small cutout for the mooring lines hole. Even though the instructions do not mark it so, I just think it will add a little extra to the bow look. And having dealt with the smaller pieces, I make my way to the bigger sections of the hull. You are seeing the sped up sequence, but I took special focus on going slowly and carefully, trying to be as precise as I can to avoid any mistakes, particularly when dealing with this very prominent element. And this is everything that I need to build up the sections for the port side, with a couple of hole tabs for when gluing the big sections together. And in order to finish up assembling both the stern section and bow section, I just need to prep them up with some folding and shaping. But before I begin assembling any of that, there is a crucial step I need to cover first, literally. And that is to paint the exposed white edges of the pieces to a proper color. For that job, I'm using for the first time some premium brand color pencils that I had now for some time. And I have to say, what a difference do they make for this kind of delicate job. They color very smoothly, almost feels buttery, and they leave a fantastic cover with very rich color as you can see here. Really happy with switching and upgrading to these premium color pencils. Okay, now that everything is prepped up, it's time to glue and finish up the assembly for these whole sections. I decide to start with the bow here first, adding its anchor well and upper forecastle structure. And coming up and closing up the shaping seam on the stern, that's all three whole sections completed and ready for installation. But before I can proceed to fully wrap the frame with the hull, I had to go off camera and basically repeated the same procedure for the starboard side of the ship to complete the set of sections. And as exciting as this is starting to look, I'm just about to wrap up this update. It has been already a big visual jump going from the bare frame structure to having a real sense of scale by adding the bow and stern decks plus having the whole sections mounted here. On the other side, I think it will be exciting to kick off the next update with the completion of the hull. With that said, and about that little surprise I mentioned at the beginning of the video, the next project I will be working on is this entry-level gunpla kit of the classic Gundam version. I will be beginning my plastic model journey with something rather straightforward. But I also pretend to start learning and practicing with some new products, tools and techniques that I am gathering for future builds. Soon I'll have my chance to see if I get hooked up into this new hobby, although I'm certainly considering trying out some other kits in the future. But what's for sure is that my next episode it will all be about this guy instead of the Queen. So thank you all for being here. I hope you enjoyed watching me build up this model as much as I enjoyed putting it together. Have a great day and see you next time. Bye bye.